Good evening, everybody, and welcome back to Science Pub. My name is Nathan Moses, the Associate Director of Events and Engagement at OSU-Cascades here in Bend, Oregon. We're thankful once again to get the experience of hearing from one of our great academic minds at Oregon State University this evening. And tonight, we will kick off this holiday season with the discussion of an iconic symbol to one of the many religious and or social traditions this time of year, the Christmas tree. We are privileged tonight to be able to hear from Chal Landgren, representing OSU Extension Services, as he presents Your Christmas Tree. What does a grower do in the 7 to 12 years before you cut a tree? Before we get to our program tonight, we'll give you a quick reminder about our audience participation. All right, and we're going to get this together. So just as a reminder, like all science pubs, hearing from the audience is one of the most rewarding parts of the show. We want to hear from you, so participants for tonight's Science Pub may submit questions to our presenter via the YouTube live chats or via the Mentimeter app found at www.menti.com. You're going to use the event code 44389067 that is just on your screen as well. If your questions aren't answered, feel free to submit the questions to events@osucascades.edu, and we'll make sure we get those questions answered for you. For the convenience, you're going to find the QR code here on the screen, and we'll keep that event code up throughout the presentation. And as a test for our audience to make sure that you are all up to speed with the app, we have a little tree survey, if you will, for all of you before tonight's presentation, just to see where our audience is at. Hopefully at this point, you are logged into the application and you see the first question on the screen, which will be coming up right now. As a reminder for our audience, we do have about a 10-second delay on the feed, so just go ahead and participate at your own pace, and we'll show you on screen where we're at for each of the questions. So I'll give everybody a little bit of time to get logged in here and make sure we've got some participation, but folks can start answering here with the first question. It looks like we got a couple coming in. So the first question that we're asking tonight, what species type of tree do you have at Christmas? And looks like we've got a couple noble firs, couple Douglas firs, and then a fake tree or none currently as the selections. We'll wait for a couple other people to get on. Noble fir, we got another species added in here. So a little bit of a good little distribution for the first question. All right. We will move on to the next question, but feel free to keep putting your inputs in as we go along. Question 2 of the night, where do you typically get your tree? Do you go to U-Cut Farm, which those are quite fun, Service Club, Nursery, Big Box Store, National or Estate Forest, or do you grow your own? I will say a little helpful tip on that if you're new to Oregon. The National Estate Forest route is really good, but make sure you know exactly where you're going when you're cutting your tree down, or you run the risk of losing your family in the middle of the woods before it hits dark time. So I will say I've had experience with that. It was fun, but I learned a lot. Okay, looks like U-Cut Farm and Big Box Store are the top ones for this one for right now. All right, let's try another one. So how many years have you selected the same tree species for your home? Do you change it up yearly? Is it every 2 to 5 years you change it up? 5 to 10 years? Or have you always changed it? So far, it's hard to get away from the tradition. So got a couple of you with 3 of you now with you keep the same one forever. A couple of you 5 to 10 years, a little bit of change, but pretty consistent. All right, that's good to know. So again, pretty equal distribution. 2 of you changing yearly, 2 to 5 years for 1 of you, and 5 to 10 years for 3 of you. It looks like somebody else added in for forever. So that's great. All right, this is going to give Chal a good idea of what audience participation he's going to have tonight, what he has to look forward to in presenting. So we'll direct some of the questions accordingly. So what are the 2 most important traits for your tree to have? And again, you can pick 2 on here, aroma being one of them, open foliage, so you can see through it, I always think of that as like the Charlie Brown Christmas tree. Maybe not quite that much, but that's always what I think of. Dense foliage, a little bit easier to hang all those 800,000 ornaments you've acquired over 3 generations. Narrow tree, wide tree, or keepability, so less needle drop. Looks like aroma and dense foliage so far, pretty high up there, 33%, 25%. I would have to agree. I do like my trees pretty dense. The keepability, the cleanliness factor. We do a snow village with like a little train track underneath our tree. So sometimes if it drops too many needles, it gets quite problematic on the train track, keeping it clean. So I will say that keepability is a big aspect. All right, so it looks like aroma, dense foliage, and keepability, the top 3 from the participants tonight. And then finally, if you could design the ideal tree, what 2 traits would you like? Lightweight, little needle loss, fresh in the home for 1 to 2 weeks, fresh in the home for 2 to 4 weeks, strong branches, or dark green color. So same thing, I think you can put two traits in here to vote on. Little needle loss, freshness. Oh, that's rising up, 2 to 4 weeks. Little needle loss is still the top. All right, so it looks like fresh in the home for 2 to 4 weeks, followed very closely after little needle loss, and then followed by strong branches and dark green color. And I'll say I'm surprised, especially that looks like a lot of you aren't going into the forest to go to cut your tree, but I will say in my particular case of getting lost in the middle of the woods, I wish we would have picked a lighter tree because it would have made the hike back a lot easier. But it looks like fresh for home for 2 to 4 weeks and little needle loss are our winners for tonight. Well, perfect. Well, the next screen that I've got up, you all should have on your apps once you complete the questions, is the opportunity to ask questions through our Mentimeter app. So you can actually ask questions anytime throughout the presentation. So feel free if something during the presentation jumps to mind and you want to ask about it, or wait to the end of the presentation. It's completely up to you, but regardless, we definitely appreciate the participation tonight. And what I'd like to do right now is get right into the introduction of our speaker. So Chal Landgren completed his bachelor's degree in forestry at the University of California, Berkeley in 1975. He went on to get his master's degree in silviculture and forest management at Utah State. While working as a forester for the U.S. Forest Service in Northern California, he heard about a job with OSU Extension, where he was hired in 1979 as one of 4 new extension foresters. Chal's been a leader in the field of Christmas trees, playing a crucial role in applied research and education to help tree growers. He is well known for his pioneering efforts in testing and identifying the best families of major native species like Douglas fir and noble fir and grand fir. Chal is currently enjoying his retired life with his wife, Susan, their children and grandchildren, who all live in the Pacific Northwest, and spending more time in pursuit of lifelong passions for photography, skiing, hiking, and tree farming. We very much thank Chal for his time tonight, and without further ado, we'll let him take stage now. Chal, the screen is yours, my friend, and we'll be giving you a few moments to get your screen ready. So take it away when you are good to go.
Well, good evening. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. I'll get to the beginning here. And I hope you've all enjoyed this beautiful day we've had before the rain comes back tomorrow. So, but today was just outstanding. The topic tonight is what do Christmas tree growers do in all those years before the harvest? So, and I get the same question after my 3 weeks of fame in November and December. People wonder if I go into hibernation for the rest of the year. So it's kind of not very visible what Christmas tree growers are doing, but it's a lot of hard work. For Douglas fir, it takes about 5 or 6 years to grow to a harvest size tree. For noble fir, it's about 7 to 9. For Nordman and Turkish fir, we're talking probably about 8 to 10 years. So I've organized this presentation this evening to kind of work backwards from what growers are doing today. And we'll see some shots of what's happening in the field right now with growers working the last month and up through Christmas. Then I want to just discuss some of the problems that growers encounter, and talk a little bit about production trends. So that's the way I'd like to organize tonight. In terms of what's happening right now, as we speak today, we're going through tree harvesting, and in the left side is more of the high-tech harvesting with helicopters. Helicopter harvesting was pioneered in Oregon, and it's probably the way a lot of the larger and mid-sized growers are working on harvesting trees. On the right side is a lower tech version. My son Peter, now 31 years old, helping me on my tree harvest at our own farm with just hauling trees by hand and cutting them down with the chainsaw. So a lot more work and not as quick. So getting the trees to the market, you can see the helicopter loading in one of the designed helicopter vans. These vans were designed to be used with helicopter harvesting. So they're right from the helicopter into the truck and then out to be shipped off. But before the harvesting, growers spend a lot of time with sizing and tagging the trees. Trees are tagged by size and grade before the harvest, before the helicopter comes or the chainsaw comes, so that they're sorted by grade, species, size, and tagged accordingly. And before some of that happens, there's inspections that happen by the Oregon Department of Agriculture, the Washington Department of Agriculture, and different states have different requirements for what they want or don't want or in their trees. And Hawaii is one that's very particular on not allowing slugs. So growers have developed various techniques to try to eliminate slugs, because if a slug is found by the Hawaiian inspectors, the entire container is rejected and sent back, or they have to go through a fairly expensive cleaning up process in Hawaii. So one of the growers, and what we're showing here is a slug on a fellow's hand there on the left of your screen. And what one grower has worked out is a water bath. So the trees are baled and sent through a water bath at a higher temperature, high water temperature that will kill the slugs and not damage the trees. So the trees go through this water bath, and then on the right side, we're just doing some experiments where we're looking at were the slugs killed and how many were found on the trees. So we purposely put bags of slugs in the trees to see how the temperature was doing, and found a temperature that was effective on removing the slugs. And other growers, rather than going through this water bath process, try to make sure that the trees are never on the ground overnight. So they're taken and put on pallets and trying to keep the trees off the ground as much as possible. So that's one of the inspection processes that growers have to go through for truck loading. The other thing that happens is the inspectors will come and make sure that the trees have been properly shaken. So trees that are particularly the ones that are exported into Mexico or Hawaii and some of these other ports of entry have to be shaken for a certain period of time. And then they'll be looking for whether or not there's any bugs that come out of the trees that are not allowed in the various ports of entry. So that's a process that's happened probably a month or so ago. So let's get to kind of the truck loading part. The way harvesting works is the trees will be often taken in by helicopter to a central landing. Then in the upper right-hand corner, you can see the trees are being shaken. There's a hydraulic shaker that's shaking the trees for a certain period of time. And then the trees will be run through the baler on the left. And then they'll be stacked according to size and grade, waiting for the trucks to load. Loading and counting is next, and usually the big trees usually go on the bottom of the trucks and the lighter trees on the top. You know, a truck, you've probably seen some trucks going down the highway now. You know, they'll have somewhere between 600 and 700 trees loaded in a semi truck going down. And California is our biggest market, so there'll be a lot of trees going down the next few weeks to California. There's a few growers that do palletizing trees. Often it's the larger growers. Takes a little more time in getting the trees prepared for the pallets, but it's much quicker to unload once they get to the market. So more and more growers are moving to palletizing trees. Then finding a tree. I know we sounded like in the survey, many of the folks you got trees from U-Cut farms or from big box stores. This is a Lowe's tag on the left, and Service Club, Boy Scout group selling trees on the right. A lot of you got trees from a U-Cut farm, which is what our family runs, just a small one. Those are quite popular. There's also a lot of the U-Cut farms now are bringing in trees that are cut from maybe a more remote location on their own property. So there'll be both cut trees that you can pick from, or you can go and cut one yourself, or on the right hand is the bigger box store kind of arrangement. I think that's a Fred Meyer's. So the final product, the two different Christmas trees here I've got illustrated. The one on the left is a picture from Denmark with lighted candles on the tree. The picture on the right is my entire crew, my wife and son and daughter in front of our Christmas tree. Looked fairly similar to the one in Denmark without the candles. So that's the final product that we're trying to grow. And now we'll move a little bit backwards. So rather than going back from the end, I'm going to start at the beginning and talk about moving the clock back about 9 years for noble fir, and talk about what has to start from the very beginning to get a Christmas tree up to that harvest size in your living room. So some of the yearly tasks that growers go through, if we looked at them kind of by season, in the winter, certainly finished harvesting, order trees to plant, clean up, and nutrient management. Growers do fertilize trees, particularly as they get towards the latter part of the harvest cycle. And a lot of growers are doing tests of soil and foliage to see what the trees might need for nutrient status. In the spring, we have finished planting, disease monitoring and control, weed control and mowing are tasks that growers are working on. In the summer, we're continuing with disease and insect monitoring and control, shearing, top work, weed control, trying to keep trees alive through that first year. Most of the trees in Oregon don't have irrigation, so we're trying to keep them alive, particularly in that first year. In the fall, we've got equipment repair, inventory, tagging, and harvesting. And there's other tasks, of course, and some of these bleed into one another, but that's kind of what the year looks like for the average Christmas tree farmer. But it all starts with seed. So we have to get seed to get the seedlings, to get the trees to grow. And this is just a little bit of a primer on how we go about getting that seed. On the left, you can see the cones developing in a noble fir tree. And this grower is actually pollinating the cones at a certain, there's about a 2-week period when you can pollinize the cones and they're receptive. So that wand and the disc is delivering pollen to the cones so they can develop. On the right, we've got Mark Schmidlin and his grandson helping with the cone harvest. The trees produce the cones on the top, at the outside of the branches, and then we lower them to the ground and they're picked up. It's a long-term process. So probably Mark's grandson will be helping us maybe through high school on cone harvesting. Again, cones are harvested in the fall. They're on the tops of the trees and usually on the outer ends of the branches. So that often means we have to get lifts and to get up fairly high. On noble fir, we don't get a crop every year. It's probably 4 to 5 years between seed crops. So we have to store seed and make sure we have enough for the interim where we don't get good cone harvests. Douglas fir and Turkish fir have a little more regular cone harvest, a little more regular cone production. On the left is a seed orchard looking at Douglas fir Christmas trees that we've been harvesting for probably 10 years for cones and seed. And on the right is the beginning of a Turkish fir seed orchard at the North Willamette Station where I work. This is a picture about 2 years ago. So we should be starting to get seed on the Turkish fir orchard probably in the next few years. And both the Douglas fir and the Turkish fir are a little more regular in terms of seed production. Usually every 2 to 3 years, we'll get a decent crop for seed. All of these orchards are grafted orchards. So we graft a mature piece of the noble fir on the left or the Trojan or Turkish fir on the right. So we graft those into rootstock in the field or in pots. And then that's the start of all of these orchards. And it's probably anywhere from 7 to 15 years before we start getting seed for Christmas tree production. So it takes a lot of preparation and testing to get the right trees for each of these orchards that were being put in. And following up a little bit on the quiz that we had, one of the tests that we do for all of these species is we look at the keepability of the trees in tests, in progeny tests. So we see how frequent needle drop is. We look at color, a lot of characteristics that we're looking for, the heavy branching. And so a lot of testing has gone in before we even get to the grafting stage for a seed orchard. This is another seed orchard at North Willamette that you can see some of the traits that we're looking for. In this case, it's with Douglas fir, and this is a fairly new orchard. We're looking at very upright branching, and we're looking at trees that have a lot of branches. So unlike timber companies where they're trying to have maybe fewer knots and fewer branches and a little slower growth, we're looking for lots of branches, upright growth, and maybe not as rapid as growth as some of the timber companies would like. So we've got the seed. Now, how do we get the seed into production of seedlings for the farm? Basically, there's 2 types of seedlings that Christmas tree growers use. On the left, this is a container nursery where seeds are sown into these little cells, and they grow in greenhouses with one to two seeds per cell, and develop their entire life in those cells, or they may be moved up from a smaller cell to a larger cell. On the right, though, is what's called a bare root nursery. So the seed is sown in the nursery in the soil, and in the case of a bare root nursery, the trees will be 2 to 3 years old by the time they're removed from the nursery bed and taken out to the Christmas tree field. With the container seedlings, they can be either 1 or 2 years old, but very seldom will they be 3. And sometimes there's combinations where growers will have the first year of the seedling will be in a container, and the second year will be as a field grown bare root nursery. So the planting site is getting ready for the seedlings. So usually a year ahead of when the sites are planted. In the slide on the left, the growers applying lime before the trees are planted. Lime is one of the typical amendments that are added in Christmas tree production to kind of control the acidity of the soil. And then the soil is often tilled or disked, worked up for planting in the subsequent spring. So now we're ready to plant. Tree planting is done by mechanical tree planters, like on the left, an old style planter, or by shovel if you don't have a tree planter and a tractor. So that's the common way trees are planted. And in this case, we're looking at planting the 2-year-old plugs that are on the right with a large mechanical planter that you can see on the left. So they can plant quite a few trees in a day, and it's quick work. The first year, what we're looking at is trying to get the seedlings to survive. As I mentioned, most of the growers don't have access to irrigation. And as we've moved into some very hot summers the last 3 or 4 years, we've had various experiments trying to look at different techniques to get seedlings to survive without supplemental water. So on the left is a trial that we were looking at using coarse wood chips or mulch spread around the tree. And we have a summer intern measuring temperatures and soil moisture on trees that had mulch or not mulch, and looking at temperature as well as soil moisture. One of the other trials that we've been looking at is using shade. So you can see these black shade cloths that are put around the seedlings in this field. And we had a number of other treatments where we used mulch, where we used the shade cloth. We were also using some root dip hormones and various additives to see if we could get more root growth initially, so that the roots have expanded out to get what available water is in the soil. At the conclusion of this experiment, we found that the mulch was probably the most effective to getting the trees to survive. We had about a 20% improvement in survival in last 2 years ago, and that was helpful. But in some cases, in some of the years where trees are just running out of water, none of these treatments they'd be helpful, but not getting 100% survival. So last year we had survival rates, where we only had 10% or so of the trees that survived the growing season. So some of the growers are going to be having to replant entire fields. And it's a particular problem with noble fir. Douglas fir is a little more robust in terms of its root growth and hardiness to survive drought. Noble fir is a little more tender. Nordman and Turkish fir have a little bit deeper root system. Those species try to establish their roots rather quickly and get down. They don't grow very fast from the top, but they do quite a bit of root growth in that first year. So a lot of growers have had to haul water into trees to water by hoses and hand and drip lines. So it's been a challenge the last few years to get trees to survive, especially noble fir. All of you can probably remember the heat dome effect that we had in June this last summer. Lost a lot of trees to the heat dome, and we also had damage on mature trees. And these are pictures of showing some of the new growth that has wilted down. And these are both noble and Turkish fir fields. First year seedlings had a real tough time surviving those days of 115 degrees. So noble fir was probably the tree that was the most damaged in some of the valley sites where temperatures were pretty high for 3 days. So it was a tough year, and hopefully we won't have to deal with the heat dome again. So moving on to kind of what are growers doing year by year. In the first 2 to 5 years, particularly on noble fir, growers are doing basal pruning. So that's the process on the left where growers are cutting off the bottom branches. This does a number of things for the field. It helps with the airflow through the tree, so we're getting less disease pressure building up on dense trees. It also gives you a place to put the tree stand without having to cut the branches when you get it home. So, and when the trees are starting to get too wide, as the picture on the right, growers will start doing side shearing. So basal pruning is first, and then working on side shearing to keep the trees fairly narrow. Particularly noble fir, each tree will involve a lot of different decisions about how wide growers want it, how long growers will leave the leaders, and where to cut the leaders. So a narrow tree, you might cut the leader if it's growing too fast, at about 4.5 feet. If the tree's too wide, they'll be doing a lot more side shearing and then trying to encourage the top to grow, to straighten out. So when we move to years 6 and 8, side shearing and top work become kind of the order of the day, for at least for the culturing part of growing trees. And with noble fir and a lot of the true firs, getting a leader to form on the top is it's a time-consuming effort where you're using a lot of sticks and ties to try to get the leaders to form straight and look more natural. As the trees get bigger, they get more expensive to work with, and you can see one of the guys on the left using stilts to start working the tops of the trees to tie up leaders. Stilts or ladders are commonly used in fields. More and more, some of the workers are getting very comfortable with using these stilts to walk around the fields. And in cutting the tops, we're also using plant growth regulators now that try to minimize the amount of effort and time needed in cutting tops. So growers are using lots of techniques and time in controlling the expansion of the leaders. Some of the yearly activities that happen are growers are doing scouting to look for insects and disease problems. Particularly right around bud break is the time when growers are out there looking for disease problems and insects. And a common way of looking is with a hand lens or putting a white sheet beneath branches and then kind of moving the branch or shaking the branch so you can get insects to fall off, and you can look on the sheet about what insects are out there at a particular time. Because a lot of these disease and insect problems, you have to be proactive. You can't wait till the problem develops, or you're better off not waiting till the problem develops. You have to kind of be ahead of the curve, particularly with our disease problems. Some of the problems that are common for growers on the left is a twig weevil infestation in a Nordman fir stand. On the right, probably our most common insect problem are dealing with aphids. And again, trying to be proactive and knowing when the problem starts so you can get ahead of the control is something growers spend a lot of time working on. Some of the other problems that growers encounter are illustrated in this slide, where you've got wet sections of a field, diseases like Phytophthora will develop. And the illustration on the left is just showing the purple was a dye that was added to the water on a tree stand. And that's where the purple is showing is the only area on the tree where the water is still moving up the tree to nourish the tree. All the rest of that tissue has been essentially cut off. So water's not moving and the sugars aren't moving up from the soil. So the tree eventually is going to die. So it's a waterborne kind of mold, Phytophthora, that growers are fighting and dealing with, particularly in areas where it's not well drained. Some of the other problems that growers encounter are problems that develop some years but not other. One is a disorder called current season needle necrosis. So what happens is if we get some very hot days when the needles are very tender, the tree can't move calcium up fast enough to form the cell walls for the needle. So we'll get some trees that will have the needles on the current season will all turn brown and make the tree unsaleable, and we have problems with anosis root rot on the right. And these are common problems that growers are constantly on the lookout to try to sort out which trees need to be taken out early or which ones are going to make it to the harvest stage. Other problems that growers encounter are if the trees are too shaded and there's not good airflow, we get a lot of interior needles that turn brown and fall off. And if the field is too weedy, mice can be a problem girdling the trees that you see on the right, where where mice have been eating some of the bark off the trees that'll eventually kill the tree. We also have problems that growers encounter that come on all of the sudden, and it'll be a particular field, and growers will think, "Oh my, this will be the end of my Christmas tree career." And two of those are one is called web blight. So 2 years ago, we had a number of fields where web blight attacked all of the current season needles, usually on one side of the tree, and then kind of hollowed the tree out as the disease spread. We also had a disease that was kind of commonly called the purple needle eater. The needles turn purple and all of the second year needles will fall off. So those were two problems that showed their heads about 2 years ago, but we haven't seen very much of them lately. So hopefully we're past those problems. So we mentioned the problem with twig weevil. It's a fairly new problem that growers are experiencing, particularly on noble and Nordman fir. So we've had some research going on looking at the life cycle of the twig weevil, trying to figure out when to control this pest and with what product or how to control it, and looking at feeding preferences. And these are just some of the slides of what that kind of damage looks like on Christmas trees where you've got that problem. Want to talk a little bit about market trends, and then we'll finish up. Some of the management trends in market. Oregon's still the #1 producer of trees in the United States. So, and have been for probably, I don't know, 20, 25 years. This year, some of the issues that growers are dealing with are labor is becoming more and more of a problem. Finding trucks, supplies, and then COVID restrictions have made harvest a little bit harder. Maybe not as bad as last year, but growers are having to deal with all of these issues. We had a major loss of producers 4 or 5 years ago, and some land has gone out of production. Some of it's gone into hazelnuts and some other crops that are less labor intensive than Christmas trees. And we've got some new species that are coming on that I think some of the consumers would be interested in looking at. Talking about just harvests and plantings and how we've been progressing. The red line is the Christmas tree harvest levels that we've had since from 1999 to current. And the green line is planting. So the reason we had a big fallout of growers getting out of the business is in the 2000s and 2s and 3s and 4s, we had a significant overplanting of trees and not an expansion of the market. So it was too many trees chasing too small of a market. So it was a tough situation and growers were getting out of the business. Right now, we're in kind of a different position in that we're having fewer trees planted than harvest, up until here recently. So markets have been very good for Christmas tree growers, and those that were stayed in the business have been doing very well. And it's a little misleading with that green line. Those are just the trees that were planted. It's not the trees that survived. So if we look with the last warm, dry summers that we've had, that line is going to be tending down probably almost below the harvest level. So we're replanting some fields 2 and 3 times now, particularly again with noble fir. Talk about some new species that we're looking at growing. And these are ones that I had the pleasure of going over to Turkey to do some tree inspections and cone collections and seed collections. So we looked at 2 areas in Turkey where different species are grown. So in the west side of Turkey, we were looking at a new species called Trojan fir in that Kanakkale and Balıkesir area. And then typically the Turkish fir is grown in the north part of Turkey. And those are the ones that are marked, the 3 northern Turkey sites, as of Dipan, Bolu, and Karabük. So we collected seed from these areas and we've been growing them out at test sites. And on the upper right is one of the test sites up in Washington, and then some of the specimen trees on the lower right that are now ready for harvest. And that was a seed collection that we did in about 2010. And to give you just a sense of what that test plot up in Washington looked like, if you were picking your tree, it sounded like most of our respondents like dense trees. So that's a Turkish fir on the left that's pretty dense and just is a beautiful specimen, rather than the one on the right, which is one that probably none of us would like in their homes. That's actually a white fir that is very susceptible to some of our Northwest disease problems. So it tends to lose all of its foliage on the bottom, and probably not one that any of us would want in our houses. Another collection that just was started in 2020 is we went over to Georgia to do the same type of collection trip. So we identified a number of different areas in Georgia where Nordman fir grows commonly. We've collected seed there, and we've brought it back to the US to start some seed orchards. And where we're at right now with that is, this was a picture that was just taken about 2 weeks ago. So this is what, excuse me, the Nordman fir look like after one season of growth. And in next season, they will be probably tripling the size that we're seeing here. So that's what they look like after one season in the nursery. And that's my presentation tonight. Appreciate your attention, and I will stop sharing and see if there's any questions.
Perfect. Chal, thank you. That was really, really interesting. As somebody that grew up in the middle of Indiana, my grandfather developed some property and actually did some little minor tree growing. So I remember growing up kind of seeing some of these stages, and you talked about a way more of the disease and some of those pieces that growers out here have to worry about. But I remember my grandfather talking a lot about the care, and here I was thinking that the tree was just going to grow on its own and we didn't have to do anything with it. So I learned a lot at a young age, but definitely more from you. So thank you for that.
Sure.
All right, everybody. So we're going to do questions. We definitely have a number of them coming in, but as a reminder, if we could throw the Mentimeter slide up again real quick, for us to take Q&A, you're more than welcome to pop into chat for the YouTube stream, any questions that you have based on tonight's presentation, or you can put them in Mentimeter using the code 44389067 for Mentimeter. Go to menti.com, use the phone application for your mobile device, or go right in and open a new browser up and link to that code. So feel free to take questions. To get us started tonight, one of the ones that came in earlier was with around the early part of your presentation. What are the economic trade-offs in doing the helicopter trade-offs versus hand harvesting?
Yeah, good question. The helicopter, is if you've got fields where you can make a turn with the helicopter in under 2 minutes, you're probably at a site where helicopters are going to be more cost effective than hand cutting and loading. But if it's too long between the helicopter where the helicopter can get to a landing, then it's probably going to be cutting by hand and putting on trailers and taking them in on that way, because the costs can go up dramatically. I think when we were doing some helicopter harvesting on some of our own fields, it was running around just for the helicopter, $2 a tree, so they can be expensive.
Yeah, no, I hadn't even thought about the helicopter harvesting before. I think of us out here in Central Oregon with the mountains and everything else, and that's tremendously interesting. Going to YouTube here real quick. Question from Brian Lee. Other than decorations and seeds, are there other good uses for the cones? Do they contain any substances that would be worth extracting?
Oh, interesting question. Most of the use of the expired cones, I mean, there are wreath makers that use the cones in wreath products.
Mm-hmm.
There's also probably the most commonly used product is mulch in trails. So there's 3 or 4 cone extraction companies that will sell the cones that, and it depends a little bit on the species. The the true fir cones break apart. They don't stay as that nice round cone. They just break apart as soon as the seeds are extracted. So most of what's used there will be for trail mulch or, landscape decorations. The bigger cones, the pines, they can be used in a variety of decorative, arrangements, but I don't know of any terpenes or problems with using them. I don't know if they've been used for extracting the terpenes or oils from the cones.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And actually, on that mulch question, you do have somebody that looks like has been following the research around using the mulch around the seedlings. This particular commenter says you did a study a couple years ago on the use of mulch to offset drought effects in young seedlings, which we talked about. And I think the increased temperatures and some of those natural factors definitely weighed in on the effectiveness of that. Is there any additional updates that you have on the study or anything that you're hoping to do further sort of around the utilization of mulch in that process?
Yeah, we're going to do hopefully a trial this next year. I'm kind of in semi-retirement, but that's one that a test that I've been interested in. So there are a few root dips and additives that, particularly with Douglas fir, that we've seen some interesting root growth and top growth benefits from. So we're going to be looking at spraying some of these products on the trees as they're planted. So there's a grower that has developed there's a number of growers that have developed kind of a spray apparatus that works with the tree planting machine to spray the roots as the trees are planted. So two of the products look promising. So we're going to maybe try that this next year. We haven't seen positive results for most of the additives that we've used, but the mulch has been effective.
That's awesome. And you know what, one thing I hadn't considered too, again, going back to watching my grandfather do this, typically like when we have a really good growing year, what's the percentage actually look like, especially within that first year of seedlings that actually make it to year two, if we're in kind of ideal growing circumstances?
Yeah, good question. With Douglas fir, we're in a good year, we can expect 95% survival. When I've gone back and looked at progeny test results on noble fir, an ideal situation is something like 15% mortality. So, but in last year we had, it varies around the state, but there are a lot of growers that are just going to have to replant their entire fields. So trees just didn't make it.
Yeah.
Particularly noble fir.
Yeah. Yeah. I can't even imagine. I mean, just the number of challenges again that you addressed with growers, and kind of actually on that, we saw that difference between the trees planted, 15 years ago versus kind of what it looks like now. And you talked about the loss of a lot of farmers. Does typically this field tend to be kind of like generational family farms that are sort of like quote unquote passed down, or like how are folks getting into and or staying into this particular field?
Yeah, great question. And it's all over the board. They're, probably the biggest companies in Oregon vary between kind of family run huge businesses to venture capitalist firms that are just, that's just one of many parts of the portfolio. Mm-hmm. So on the medium to smaller size farms, we could use a lot more younger people to take over the family farm. Many of the U-cut farms have been in families for a long time, and maybe we'll be hoping for a new generation to take them over.
Mm-hmm. And actually, and it brings to the point, like with all the different things that you talked about being potential challenges for growers, do you see some of the Turkish fir and the Trojan fir and species like that being brought over? Because it sounds like they may be potentially more resilient than some of the current species that we're working with. Do you see that maybe being a catalyst for folks not seeing it as much of a risky venture and potentially getting into it?
Yeah, good question. The Turkish and Trojan and Nordman fir, we started looking at that a number of years ago, and other growers, because they were less susceptible to a lot of our root rot diseases that we have. So that was kind of the impetus for looking at those. But along the way, we found that they are resistant to a lot more of our insect attack problems. They're growing it naturally in a Mediterranean environment, so they grow real slowly the first 3 or 4 years while they put down a big carrot root. So the Turkish Nordman and Trojan fir have roots that go down as tall as the tree, whereas noble fir tends to have roots that spread out in the top maybe 2 feet. They don't go down very far. So they may be a species that will adapt a little better to our, to these drier summers. Growers are also looking at creative ways of trying to bring water to trees, from hauling, 2,000-gallon tanks up and installing drip lines to get the trees over that first year, because it's the first year has been really problematic, assuming we don't have any more of these heat dome effects like we had in June this year.
Mm-hmm. No, that's great. And then kind of on that same route with those new species, and Keith is actually asking this in the YouTube chat, but I'm assuming lots and lots of time was spent determining kind of what species might be the most realistic to bring over. Is there any concern, and I guess in what ways do you look at some of these non-native species and bringing over around, like, not creating invasive species or not having some sort of a dramatic impact on the area? Like, what does that process look like as you guys are determining, kind of what seeds to bring out?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. True fir conifers, it's not like invasive grass species where, they can multiply and spread over real quickly. I was looking at a field here last month where the trees are probably 40 feet tall. And when you look at the native, where the natural seedling have developed, they haven't even spread out beyond the branches of the trees themselves. So it's the invasive part. I don't see that as ever being a particular problem. A lot of the trees won't crossbreed very well because the timing of pollination is going to be different. So there's not going to be issues, I don't think, with pollen contamination or anything in that realm. But we're also trying to harvest these trees. We're not trying to let them go. So
right,
there are some arboretums in areas where you can find Nordman, Turkish, and Trojan firs, but they're pretty small.
Okay, perfect. And again, thanks for our viewers for asking that. Another question that came in, and I was familiar with grafting, but I don't know why I hadn't thought about it with Christmas trees. So kind of what is some of the benefits with grafting of trees versus, and the commenter saying versus using old trees? I'm assuming kind of the seeding process is what they're referring to. Translate it how you will, but what is the big benefit of using grafting, and when would you use it as opposed to not?
Yeah, great question. What we use grafting is, we do that for a number of reasons. One is what we're doing is taking a mature piece of wood from another tree and grafting it on a young tree. So it takes, let's say, 20 to 25 years for a noble fir to be mature enough to start producing cones. Whereas if it can start with a tree that's already 50 years old, we're cutting down that time frame of getting that tree to produce produce cones. Also, we've been doing we do progeny tests before we do, decide what we want to graft. So when, say, we have one outstanding tree, we can graft that outstanding tree on many different trees in an orchard to try to get more of that particularly wonderful tree into production.
That's great. There's definitely more than one question that was asked about that. So thank you. That's interesting. It's super interesting. Somebody's asking from our Central Oregon audience, if you're going to be like Nathan and go out and hopefully not get your family lost in the middle of the woods looking for your perfect Christmas tree, what are some really good areas to maybe hit up in the Central Oregon region, at least kind of in your experience, to go find their perfect Christmas tree?
To find a U-cut farm in Central Oregon?
It looks like this is probably referring to national or state forest lands.
Okay, I would check. You check with the local ranger district, and hopefully Nathan, they'll have a great map. It's there aren't many signs out in national forest roads, so follow somebody, take an extra lunch, and kind of mark your way in. I remember we were doing some collections out at a national forest on the coast, and there was a hunter that was lost back in there. He'd been there for a day and a half, and he was so happy to see us. We told him we'd be there all day collecting cuttings. He said, "I'll just wait. I'm not going to try to drive out without following you." So he was definitely glad to see us.
Yep. No, that's, oh man, I feel like I could write a book on that experience of what not to do in the future, and potentially listen to your partner when she has better sense of direction than you do. So let's see here. Oh, how about, do you have a favorite species of Christmas tree yourself?
We grow mostly Turkish. We're starting to grow Turkish fir on our own farm. And part of that's because of root diseases that we've found in we've been growing trees since 1982, and they're just becoming more root diseases on the noble fir. And then after this last heat dome, we have very few nobles that survived. The south side just turned red, and they're just not saleable this year, whereas most of the Turkish fir look okay. So that's kind of that's our favorite.
Nice. Well, actually, leading right into that, with climate change accelerating, do you expect new areas in Oregon and Washington to start growing Christmas trees? Maybe potential new lands that might support them well. And I think like you talked about, so the heat that we've seen in the last couple of years as kind of prime examples in this, has that started moving people maybe looking for the north or looking in new pockets where they hadn't looked before?
Yeah, that'll be an interesting development. The better noble fir sites tend to be higher elevation, on the Silverton Hills, or out towards Sheridan and the hills on the coast. So I could see where if we get these heat events and less rainfall, the whole production moving up the mountain a little bit, into areas that were not Christmas tree sites to begin with.
Mm-hmm. Okay, excellent. I think this is a really loaded question because of everything you talked about, but again, my head is kind of spinning right now thinking, wow, that's why Christmas trees cost what they do, because of the level of management. Like, I think a lot of folks just aren't exposed to just the amount of work that it actually takes. When you look at seedling costs, like, what is it like when you're showing the first year kind of seedling area? What do those guys look like per seedling? And then how much does the planting process actually cost per plant?
Yeah, great question. The typical 2-year-old plug seedling will probably cost something in the neighborhood of 50 to 60 cents a tree. Machine planting, if you can do it and have the machine, is going to be pretty cheap on the planting. But if it's hand planting, if you have to pay contractors to do it, it's going to cost about the same amount as the tree itself. And then, the shearing costs build up as the tree gets bigger, and the top work costs, if you're having to have people on stilts walking through the field, doing individual treatments on trees, those costs can be, upwards of 50 to 60 cents a tree. Harvesting alone costs about $5 a tree. So, those are some of the typical costs that growers have.
Okay, no, that's wonderful. That really does help. On the shearing topic, I can kind of imagine, like you talked about, I think the Douglas was the example, and I can't remember from the pictures, you correct me if I'm wrong, but you were talking about like some of the trees, like the early stages, keeping them relatively narrow, and then as they got taller, they got wider and kind of trimming up and giving them that kind of iconic shape. Is there a particular species that we work with in the Pacific Northwest that if we were just to let to grow like crazy, no shearing, nothing, would look so vastly different from what I guess gets sent to market?
Yeah, Douglas fir would be unrecognizable. They'd be so, the Douglas fir, the shearing and culture work is very formulaic. The trees grow pretty much this, in sync with each other. And if we let them go, they would be going 3 to 4 feet a year after they've been planted for 3 years. So, without that side shearing and top control, they would be out of your living room range pretty quickly. Some of the trees like the Turkish and Nordman grow slower, and they can, depending on how fertile the site is, you can almost get by without having to do a lot of work on those. But if you get 2 or 3 years where they're growing too fast, or with 2 to 3 feet of growth in a year as they age, they're going to be too tall too quickly. But they can look more natural, as without doing a lot of work.
So, all right, and let's see, another part, kind of cultivation process. What sort of other things are used in the cultivation process as far as like pesticides, and like, are there processes in which certain pesticides are used, and some, and I guess I hate to use the term organic, but are done a little bit more organically where you're not using some of those non-natural elements? Like what kind of does that look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. And one of the concerns of a lot of consumers. So it depends again sort of on the species and the year. There's very few insect pests that are problematic on the Turkish and Nordman. On say the most common one is aphid damage. Aphids eating Douglas or more nobles and grand fir.
Mhm.
There are growers that are anti-spray at any kind, and they're going to be bringing in beneficial insects. But it's a very different mindset if that's the way a grower wants to move, because the beneficial insects, you have to get them in there before there's a problem. So you have to bring them in, or you have to encourage pollinator plants in the field so that those beneficial insects have something to feed on before they can move over to the aphids. So it's a longer term strategy to try to get some of those natural beneficials to control a problem like aphids on grand fir that could build up very quickly. So growers have been moving, they'll be using some insecticides if that becomes a problem. And you kind of move up the scale of how toxic are the various insecticides to the insect, and how toxic are they to people. So you just kind of find the least, that kind of sweet spot where you can use the best product for the control that you need.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And then I think, let's see, let me double check on our YouTube stream. As always, I got my head bouncing around all over the place looking at our points of input here. Looks like that's all the questions from YouTube, but I do have one final one from our Minty. And again, folks, really just appreciate everybody's participation. It makes this way more fun when you have lots of questions for us. So I definitely appreciate that. The last one, and this may be kind of an OSU Extension question, because I know that OSU Extension provides a lot of community teaching and resources and education for things. This particular question is around what are the best resources for someone interested in Christmas tree farming with no previous experience in the field?
Great question, and thanks for ending with that. You know, my website, I would say, would be the place that I would suggest people starting. So if you just do probably a web search on my name and North Willamette Research and Extension Center, you'll find my my website. That, and I say my website, actually Judy Kowalski keeps it up to date and populates it. So Judy's done a great job in putting together all the OSU publications. You can also just go to OSU publications and type in Christmas trees, and you'll see a lot of the videos and publications that we've been able to produce over the years. So that's where I'd start. And if you go to the North Willamette's website, it also has my cell phone, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Perfect. And then for everybody, I'm moving around a whole lot. I actually just put that in chat for YouTube. So if anybody wants to pull that up, I'm sure, again, if there's any questions you have after the presentation, again, let myself know at events@osu-cascades.edu, or just email Chal directly. So that definitely 2 resources, but I know that OSU Extension just does an absolutely amazing job of being able to provide resources for the community on so many topics that I didn't even know people were asking about. But it's always quite impressive to see what OSU Extension is able to provide. So I think on that note, Chal, we're perfect timing. So I want to see if there's any kind of parting words from you as the presenter tonight, and then I'll kind of wrap up after you're completed.
No, it's just been a pleasure to chat with folks tonight. My suggestion on getting your tree this year would be do it early. There'll be plenty of trees for those early birds, and hopefully you won't get lost out in the national forest.
Don't go with me.
Yeah, that sounds good. Thank you.
Well, perfect. Well, we'll keep you on our Zoom webinar right now, but for everybody else, I just want to thank everyone for attending. Big thanks for Chal, the time of not only prepping and the delivery for this presentation, but the amazing contributions to OSU Extension, the academic community, and beyond. Clearly, we're talking about global perspective here. So again, thank you for all that work. As always, a special shout out to our Connect Central Oregon crew, who've successfully been utilizing their career training and intern program to help us put these virtual events on. And again, all of you for participating. So this concludes our Science Pub for Monday, November 8th, 2021. Tell a friend about your experiences tonight. Share this presentation link. And again, we'll see you next time, Beaver Nation, out there. Thanks again.